I'm Professor Kathy Lanctot, but I think you knew that. Nice to see all of you here. Tomorrow's Groundhog Day, but it's a little Groundhog Day because I stood here last year, I wrote down the date, March 16th, 2016, to discuss the nomination to the Supreme Court of Merrick Garland, who has had a very esteemed first year on the Supreme Court. Not. Someone has reserved a seat here for Merrick Garland right here in the front row. As you will recall, Merrick Garland was nominated to the court by President Obama last year, did not receive a hearing, and he pretty much landed on his feet because he remains the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, but he's going to be some kind of Final Jeopardy answer someday. Nothing wrong with that. And so last night we had the nomination by the president of Neil Gorsuch to become Associate Justice for the Supreme Court. What I'm going to do is just say a few things about that nomination and a few things generally about Supreme Court nominations, and then I'd be happy to answer your questions, happier, I guess I would say, to answer your questions than to blather, not that I couldn't blather for a long time, but also I have con law 2 at 1 o'clock, so we've got to get things done expeditiously as possible. So a couple things about Gorsuch is Judge Gorsuch is that he's widely been described today as, I think I could fairly say, Scalia 2.0. He's considered to be a conservative judge with impeccable conservative credentials. He is going to be, if he is confirmed, the first justice to serve on the court with the justice for whom he clerked. He clerked for Justice Byron White, and then when Justice White stepped down, Justice Kennedy picked him up, and so he and Kennedy would be serving together on the court, which would be an interesting thing. He's not going to be the first justice to have clerked for a Supreme Court justice. That's getting kind of common right now. Justice Kagan clerked for Thurgood Marshall. Chief Justice Roberts clerked for Justice Rehnquist, who himself clerked for Robert Jackson. Justice Breyer clerked for Arthur Goldberg. So it's not unusual to be a Supreme Court clerk and then move up, but it's really unusual to sit there and be an equal with the person who was your mentor. He's also seen as diversifying the court in some way because he's from Denver, and in our world that counts as diverse on the Supreme Court because he does not come from the coasts. But otherwise, he has the traditional credentials that we've seen in Supreme Court justices, Columbia undergrad, Harvard, Oxford, a clerkship with Judge Santel, and an impressive legal career. Apparently, I just noticed this in my last perusal before I came down. He's also an Episcopalian. In our world today, that is diversifying the Supreme Court because there are currently no Protestants on the Supreme Court. This, of course, was unheard of even a few decades ago, where the court used to have one seat that was considered to be the so-called Jewish seat and one Catholic seat. Now the court has no Protestants on it. And so if you were looking at Neil Gorsuch last night and thinking, does he look like a diverse candidate? Well, he's diverse in that way. He diversifies religiously. He diversifies based on Denver. Ideologically, the New York Times had a chart this morning where they showed, where he was on the spectrum, and they showed him a little to the right of Scalia. For some people, that's his biggest selling point. For other people, that's a physical impossibility. But he's shown in there between Scalia and Justice Thomas. As to the confirmation process, I'll say a couple things, and then, as I said, I'll take questions. As to the confirmation process, no one knows. It used to be that presidents would nominate people to the Supreme Court, and then there would be, hearings, and then there would be a vote. That kind of came apart last year. We're in a brave new world right now. I think in light of the political lineup currently, Neil Gorsuch will be confirmed to the Supreme Court eventually, but whether that will be because there's a filibuster that's broken or because the Republicans vote to do away with the filibuster and then use 52 votes to put him through, whether the Democrats decide, well, we don't want to fight this battle, we'd rather fight the next one, it's unclear. But I think, unlike last year, I think the odds are pretty good that that Neil Gorsuch will serve on the court. Having said that, it's not easy. Well, two things. I want to come back to the second, to keeping your powder dry, and then say one last thing before I take some questions about nominations generally. People are already speculating about whether this is just the warm-up for the next nomination. It must be a strange thing to be on the Supreme Court and have people waiting for you to die. Because that's kind of what it is. It's always a very ghoulish thing about, well, when the next one dies, this is what's going to happen. And we know just from last year that people who had the death pool on the Supreme Court had Justice Ginsburg a lot higher than Justice Scalia, and yet Justice Scalia, of course, left us very suddenly, and Justice Ginsburg, at this point, is probably going to have herself sustained on life support for the next 8 years. So you just don't know how things transition on the Supreme Court. Sometimes there's this elaborate theory today that, well, they named a Kennedy clerk because then Justice Kennedy will see that it's okay for him to retire, and then they can name someone else. I mean, I guess it's 42-dimensional chess. I'm not really sure. Those justices up there have lifetime tenure. They can come and go as they please, and so I'm not sure they're so easily manipulated by that kind of nomination. But it's certainly true that the next nomination, depending on who it is who retires or departs, could be more consequential. This one, in some ways, is swapping in a younger version of Justice Scalia, people think, but it's not altering the balance. If Justice Ginsburg were to go, or even Justice Kennedy, who currently, as you know, occupies the center of the court, if he were to go, that nomination, I would suggest, would be more consequential in the direction of the court. And then the last thing I'll say, until I say a million other things, but the last thing I'll say before I see what you all have on your minds is the process of changing the direction of the court by judicial nomination. If you've taken a class with me, you've probably heard me blather about this before, but I will blather about it again. I have this quote. The reason I brought down this piece of paper is so that I would not butcher the quote. Alexander Bickel, a very famous scholar of the Supreme Court, said many years ago, "You shoot an arrow into a far distant future when you appoint a justice, and not the man himself can tell you what he will think about some of the problems that he will face." And I've always liked that quote because the idea of shooting an arrow into the future, I think, is very true about the Supreme Court. So all this commentary today about, well, he's going to do this on religious liberties and that on the Second Amendment, and he's going to do this with respect to regulations. I mean, we know something about how he's ruled in the past, but as history has shown us time and time again, justices are put on the court for one thing, and then, amazingly, all kinds of different issues come before them, about which oftentimes they've never thought. Justices also come to the court, and they are affected by being on the court. They're affected by their colleagues. And sometimes they're affected by the direction that the country takes. And so we've seen in many situations where judges have changed their position. Some judges have become more liberal as time's gone by. That's actually more common for some reason. Some justices become more conservative. Some justices, John Paul Stevens, famously said, well, I didn't move my position. The entire court moved around me, which is probably true. After all, he was named to the court in 1975. He's not on the court anymore, but he's a spry 92. And in his view, the court, he stayed right there and the court moved. And so it's a really imperfect way to change Supreme Court precedent, to change the direction of the Supreme Court, to put people on the court. People can be reliable, but not so much. I have my usual quotes I've used in some classes with presidents who have regretted their appointments and have said, Eisenhower was famously asked, what were the biggest mistakes you made as president? And he said, well, there are two of them, and they're on the Supreme Court, Brennan and Warren. Teddy Roosevelt famously said, well, famously in my circles, famously said of Oliver Wendell Holmes, I could carve out of a banana a judge with more backbone than that. Oliver Wendell Holmes. They accused Oliver Wendell Holmes of having the backbone of a banana. Famously, Justice Souter is a rallying cry, particularly in conservative circles. No more suitors. And there's always the fear that the next justice will be Souter. You think Souter was Satan. I mean, Souter's kind of a mild-mannered relatively moderate Republican, but when he was added to the court, he was seen as a reliable vote for a variety of conservative issues on the court, and he turned out to be a little more independent, a little bit less reliable. Even Chief Justice John Roberts has disappointed, and he was groomed to be on the Supreme Court. He was the darling of conservative legal circles, an originalist, and yet he upheld that health care thing, Affordable Care Act, and when he wrote that opinion, there were howls about his disloyalty. And so my point is that we don't, presidents do what they do, hoping to have a particular influence on the court, but lifetime tenure, as many of us know, creates a certain amount of independence. And in that respect, you don't know what the judge will do or the justice will do 10, 30, 40 years down the line. The president said something about how this is a young judge who could sit on the court 50 years. I thought that was a bit of an exaggeration last night because he would be 99 at that point, but you never know. The longest sitting justice, William Douglas, did sit on the court 36 years. When you go on the court, as Douglas did in 1939, and you leave the court in the 70s, you've seen a lot of issues come that no one anticipated at the time of the New Deal. So there's going to be a lot of hue and cry over this appointment, but it's going to take a while to see how things develop once, if and when Judge Gorsuch becomes Justice Gorsuch. Let me stop there and take a breath and see what's on your mind. Yes, sir.
I guess the answer would be evident given where Gorsuch falls on the political scale, but do we know where he stands on criminal justice reform issues, such as death penalty, sentencing?
I don't think we do know him. I've seen a little bit today that suggests that he tends toward law enforcement, but is a little bit skeptical in some cases. But it's hard to know. Keep in mind, when justices sit on the courts of appeals, they are generally writing an opinion with at least two other judges, unless they are writing a dissent. And so we can't always crystallize what his views are on that. But it raises a question I did want to address, which is, again, I've obviously spent the whole morning surfing, reading things about this nomination. I saw a suggestion that he must be questioned on how he's going to come out on all the events of the last 11 days. Most of the time, judges who are questioned by the Senate, when they're asked about pending cases or potential pending cases, respectfully decline to answer, on the theory that they're supposed to decide these cases when they come before them and not prejudge them. Famously, every time there's going to be, we have a justice named, there are questions about their views on Roe v. Wade and abortion, and generally they decline to answer. And so I'm not sure we're going to know anything more about any of these judges, about his appointment or any other future appointment based on the confirmation hearings. Go ahead. Wow, okay. Other questions before I start calling on people? Yes?
So, well, I saw the slide, the scale of ideologies in the New York Times, too. Do you think it's true that this guy is actually to the right of Scalia?
It is physically possible. I was kidding. I'll tell you why people identify that. I mean, in many ways, he is seen as the heir to Justice Scalia. I just read this morning, he wrote a very nice tribute after Justice Scalia passed away last year. And he, you know, he comes from conservative legal circles, and the conservative legal circles, the Federal Society Heritage Foundation, work very closely with the president in vetting a list of candidates. And so for that reason, I think you can be sure that anyone on that short list, whoever was in the green room waiting to be called out last night, I had a real fear when they said they were flying multiple candidates in, that there was going to be some kind of steel cage death match, and whoever the victor is gets a Supreme Court seat. But they've all been carefully vetted for their views. I think the reason that they're describing him this way is because of his administrative law views with respect to Chevron. I'm trying to see if anyone looks like they've ever heard of that case before. Judge Gorsuch has apparently written an opinion or two that suggests that he's even more skeptical about deference to agencies than Justice Scalia was, and Justice Scalia had an administrative law background. And so there's that. The flip side of that is that the image of Scalia as being perfectly consistent is a little bit of a misnomer. As we know, even Justice Scalia occasionally decided cases in ways that were not entirely predictable, sometimes but not always. He was more of a libertarian sometimes on some Fourth Amendment issues. He occasionally was on some free speech issues. And so even Justice Scalia was not perfectly predictable. But my broader point is that nobody knows. And I don't think he's going to say. People, when they get into the confirmation hearings, tend to find a way to say, well, I would like to answer that, but I cannot. I might also add, since I can't stop, that Scalia was confirmed 99-0. I say again, people, 99-0. Not one negative vote against Scalia. That was a different era back in the 1980s, a kinder, gentler time, where people, it was a very different attitude towards confirmations, but Scalia was confirmed with no votes. I'm not a betting person, but I will bet that Neil Gorsuch will not be confirmed unanimously to the Supreme Court. Other questions about where he fits in. Let me say a couple more things then before we conclude. When we're thinking about where politics plays a role, there's going to be a lot said, I think, on both sides. First of all, each side is going to flip on whatever they said before and are going to now insist if they thought that confirmation battles should not look at ideology, now they'll say that they should and they would and vice versa. So looking for consistency with politicians is a big mistake. But I do want to say something about politics here because it is going to be the determining factor. I mean, elections do matter. I think we kind of knew that, but elections do matter. And so the fact of the matter is that President Trump won the election. The Republicans maintain control of the Senate, and therefore that's how this goes. If you have a sufficient majority in the Senate, then the candidate is likely to be confirmed. But if we're going to talk about originalism and original intent for a minute, which of course is what Judge Gorsuch's strength is supposed to be, that he's an originalist like Scalia, when it suited Scalia, wasn't always perfectly consistent. I would suggest, and I've suggested before, that the framers intended that there be a political component to the selection of Supreme Court justices, which is why I think that when we talk about the unelected branch striking things down and there's something wrong with the unelected branch interfering with the actions of the other two branches, I think it's a bit of a misunderstanding. I mean, none of the branches are politically insulated. Obviously, the presidency is elected, the legislature is elected, but the Supreme Court justices are selected through a process that in part relies on politics. The person is selected by a president who's been elected, is confirmed by a Senate which has been elected, and there's an opportunity there for advice and consent one way or the other. And so there's going to be talk, I think, about, oh, it's so unseemly to have this, or how dare they, or how dare they not, they didn't confirm ours, so we won't confirm theirs. I mean, it's unpleasant, but that, I think, is what was contemplated at the time, that there be this political check. Once the justices are up there, they're there for life. And they are insulated from politics at that point. And so I do think it's now or never with respect to having some kind of input. Having said that, the check is very indirect because generally the justices, unless they really say something, or the nominees, unless they say something that is seen as disqualifying, the process itself may not seem to be that illuminating. Chief Justice John Roberts, for example, famously said that he saw his role as calling balls and strikes. No one really thinks that, but that is what he said, calling balls and strikes. And whenever he does something people don't like, people harumph, oh, that's not calling balls and strikes. but he did not comment on how he come out on any particular case. And so the political process is not going to be eliciting people's platforms to see, well, how are you going to rule on the death penalty? How are you going to rule on abortion? How are you going to rule on exercises of presidential power, on immigration, so on? People are going to be, if you're looking for that, you're going to be very dissatisfied. Part of it's a little bit of kabuki theater of just kind of going through the motions of I bash you if you're my party and I support you if I bash you if you're not my party and I support you otherwise. But part of it is just trying to get at people's general judicial philosophy. And then once they get up there, well, then they do as they wish. Please.
There's a question.
Yeah.
I have my own.
Okay.
Do you think, I mean, all joking aside, the fact that he's from Colorado is actually something that is going to affect decisions that they make that there wouldn't be otherwise?
The question is whether being from Colorado is going to affect decisions. I mean, I don't know what to say about that. Already there's a narrative of him, being an outdoor person and skiing and mountains and not being from the, the pointy-headed liberal elite coasts. I mean, I guess yes and no. How's that for a good mushy answer? Justice Scalia, in his dissent in the same-sex marriage cases, wrote this paragraph about how the court only picked a very small was selected a very small non-diverse group, and argued that there should be people from other than the East Coast, and he said California was not part of the heartland of the country, and that was a slap at Kennedy, and that they shouldn't all come from the same schools. Now, it happens that you've got another Harvard Law School graduate on the bench because not enough, but there's some theory that he'd be more open. I don't really know the answer to that. I guess we're all products of our place. Go ahead, Bryce.
So my question was, back to your point earlier about diversity at the court. So I remember in September, then candidate Trump released a list of like 21 judges that he was looking at, included women, included people of color. Now he's like the third possible Republican pick, who's a white Christian male. So are there, in your opinion, in terms of the legal community or the consensus in politics, like, is there no one with impeccable conservative credentials who is female or a person of color?
I mean, it's an interesting question, because I remember looking at that list, and there were a few, and supposedly on his short list of 6, there was one woman. I don't know that there was anyone of color there. I don't necessarily think it's a priority of this administration to select in that way, but I think it would be healthy if it were, because of course there are conservatives of color, and there are conservatives who would provide diversity in other ways. I think that they wanted the safest possible choice here, where they wouldn't think there'd be any possible deviation from a particular orthodoxy. And as I say, every justice surprises every president. But whether that's going to be a priority going forward, it's very hard to say. I mean, I'm only half joking that his diversity is he's from Denver and he's Episcopalian. I don't know what that tells us about the state of the court, that's diversity, but I think it is. Real quick, because not only do these people have to go to class, but so do I.
Being an originalist, how does that fly with, and this might be with executive orders and things like that?
Well, I can assure you that he's not going to answer that question when people ask it. I saw people saying, oh, someone has to ask him what he thinks of Trump's executive orders. He is not going to sit there and say, oh, well, I will definitely uphold or definitely strike down. There'll be an originalist. There's an originalist argument, pro and con, I'm sure, with respect to these things. People like to pick through the history, as they say, look through the history, find your friends, and then cite them. And so I'm a little bit skeptical about whether an originalist approach necessarily leads directly to one or the other. But I can tell you that if he follows the path of most nominees, I mean, the nominee who spoke a little more openly about his views back in the 80s, Robert Bork, found himself not confirmed. And so ever since then, justices have taken the position of the less said, the better. So I don't know the answer to that. Look, thanks, guys. Nice to see all of you. Hope to see some of you in my class shortly. And